Hello out there, everyone. I will give a few minutes for everyone to join us and get on, but we are excited and ready for this very important and intentional conversation this evening around reproductive justice and the Black church. All right, I see some folks joining us. Thank you for coming on. We will give people a few more seconds to get settled, get some dinner, grab y'all drinks while we engage in this conversation. For those who do not know me, I am Ashley Spivey. I am the founder and director of IB Black Girl, and I'm really excited to be here with you all tonight as we have this very important and critical conversation around reproductive justice, abortion access, and the Black church. We have a stellar lineup of thought leaders and intellectuals that are faith leaders, right? So that intersection. And we are excited to hear their perspectives and just engage in dialogue around how the Black community unpacks the conversation around reproductive justice, how we talk about abortion access, and how faith colors and brings that perspective to life. Well, y'all are here because y'all clearly know IB Black Girl, which is exciting, but that doesn't mean you really know all that we do, right? And so IB Black Girl is a collective that creates space for Black women, femmes, and girls to access and reach our full potential. We turn 5 years old this year, and we are really making sure that we show up and position ourselves as a reproductive justice organization. So we support all of the and address all of the surrounding social systems around Black folks or reproductive systems. So that could look like voting rights, that could look like wages, that could look like our birth justice work, it can look like our economic liberation work. And we're really committed to showing up for the well-being of Black women, femmes, and girls in that journey throughout our lifespan. Please visit our website. I will drop that into the chat after this introduction so y'all can learn more, participate, and continue engaging. So just some grounding and intentions before we get started. Any comments that are derogatory, that are damaging and harmful will be deleted from the chat. We will not engage and lift up those questions. This is a space that is built around intentional conversation and healthy discourse around reproductive justice, abortion access, and the Black church, right? And that faith component. So if you are here to argue that abortion is wrong, or if you are here to be combative, like that's not the space that we are creating. So it's not the space for you. So please make sure that you are aligning to our values. Please make sure that the comments that you are putting in the chat are very thoughtful and intentional and add value to the conversation and journey that we are on. Because again, if they don't, they'll just be deleted and I will block you from this webcast. So with that, let's get into it. We have some local thought leaders that we will talk to in a minute, but I'm super excited to have Reverend Kenyatta here with us from Sister Song. Reverend Kenyatta is a Black queer woman of Caribbean heritage. She is a Florida native who resided in Atlanta for the last 23 years. So like kind of just from Atlanta at this point. As a daughter, granddaughter, and niece of generations of Pentecostal Christian ministers, she has been immersed in a faith community since birth. While a young artist singing and reciting in the church, she was always interested in using her gifts to push the world in the direction of liberation, equity, equality, and harmony. Her desire to use both her art and her faith as agents for change motivated her to attend Howard University. We're not going to hold that against her either, because you know I went to Jackson State University, but it's fine. It's still a Black college. She's doing it. First as a classical voice major, then shifting majors to musical theater. She was ordained in the Apostolic Church in 1997 as a youth minister, but has since separated from that denomination. Her quest to fully embrace the spiritual aspects of life and service led her to explore the areas of faith-based leadership by engaging in 2 9-month processes that conferred her on the titles of priestess and high priestess, respectively. In 2006, she was ordained as a minister in the Madonna Interfaith Ministries, a metaphysical ministry under her mentor, Lisa Michaels. The last 3 years, she has been using the skills she gained in faith based leadership, arts, and management to advance the work of reproductive justice as a faith advocacy coordinator for Sister Song, the Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. She is working to build a base of visible and vocal faith leaders and people of faith who openly support the cause of reproductive health, reproductive rights, reproductive access, and reproductive justice. So, with that, I would like to bring in Reverend Kenyatta.
Thank you, Ashley. Good evening, everyone. My name is Reverend Kenyatta Chinwe, and I am the Faith Advocacy Coordinator for Sister Song, the Woman of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. I am extremely honored to be able to speak with and to you tonight. When Ashley asked me to participate in this town hall and to offer some words, I considered what I would say very deeply. What became apparent to me is that this year, in the time we find ourselves, what needs to be addressed whenever I'm invited to speak is the urgency in this moment for faithful people to stand firmly and visibly on the side of reproductive justice and bodily autonomy. First, I'd like to offer some clarity on what I mean when I say reproductive justice. Often, when the term is used, many believe that what will follow is a monologue about the importance of abortion rights. Protecting abortion rights is indeed important, now more than ever in my lifetime. But the 12 Black women, some of whom themselves were faithful women, who conceptualized and implemented the frame of reproductive justice, understood that more things affect the reproductive lives of Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, and poor people than the right to an abortion. Reproductive justice is an integrative frame that aims to push the world in the direction of liberation and full bodily autonomy. When I say reproductive justice, I am speaking of the liberative movement that sits on four foundational tenets. Reproductive justice understands that every person has the human right to have a child. Because of that understanding, we advocate constantly for policies that support access to affordable and culturally competent healthcare, including mental health care. We work to raise attention to the disparities that exist in how pregnant people of color are treated within medical systems so that those policies within these systems can be changed. Reproductive justice also pushes for better wages for workers to make parenthood an affordable option for more people, because everyone deserves the opportunity to have the children they want, when and how they want. As a movement, we also assert that everyone has the human right to not have a child if they so choose. Yes, reproductive justice does advocate for everyone to have access to the full spectrum of reproductive health care, including abortions. Reproductive health care is health care, and health care should be something everyone has access to. We also understand that when people have information, they make more informed decisions for their lives. This is why reproductive justice asserts that comprehensive sexual education for everyone is so important and actually leads to less abortions, which those who seek to oppress claim to advocate for. This integrative frame of reproductive justice believes that everyone who has a child has the human right to raise that child in safe, sustainable communities, free from violence, both interpersonal and state sanctioned. So we advocate for clean water and air in our communities. We push back against the pollution of groundwater in the neighborhoods that can least afford it by large private entities that view our communities as their dumping grounds. We work in solidarity with those who push for criminal justice reform and who seek to change the policies that govern the way that policing is done in this country. We work for racial justice because we know that ending white supremacy improves the lives of not only children of color, but all children. And reproductive justice believes that every human being has the autonomy of their own body. We get to do with these bodies what we please, short of causing harm to any other living being. So we support rights of all people, including the LGBTQIA plus family. We advocate for policies that assure that queer and trans folks enjoy full citizenship and resist all policies that would restrict how they get to participate in this country that is just as much theirs as anyone else. I bet you're wondering, how is this a matter of faith? And why is it important as a faithful person for me to care about this? Well, my faith tradition calls me to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk in humility. Many of the traditions of love that are practiced by the faithful of the world teach the same. It is, excuse me, it is the through line that we can all agree upon. Whatever our theological interpretations of our sacred text, the one thing we are clear on is that we should be looking out for and taking care of the living, breathing people we already share this planet with. To me, reproductive justice is a frame, and as a frame, lives into the ethic of compassionate care that we are called to as faithful people. For too long, the narrative of faith has been used to oppress in this country. A story built on a fallacy has been the main tool used to justify the oppression of over 50% of the country's population. It is beyond time for those of us who both claim faith and believe in justice to speak out on this topic. The bodies of pregnant people are not up for public discourse. And it is morally disingenuous how some advocate for a fetus whose life would mean little to them if carried to term and born. It is time that we counter the narrative that would paint us all with a single brush and let policymakers and the culture know that our faith compels us to protect the human rights of all people, including and especially those whose lives are most affected by oppressive policies that restrict access to full reproductive health care. My current call is to lift the veil and to make the way a bit clearer for those of faith who understand that reproductive justice is not antithetical to their faith and is necessary if we are ever to see full liberation. As I close, I encourage you to learn as much as you can about reproductive justice, what it truly is, and what it actually stands for. If you are someone who claims faith, reclaim your narrative from those who would use it to oppress. And lastly, I ask you, in the words from the sacred book that I follow, to be strong and of good courage as you make your voice heard and work towards reproductive justice for all. I hope I've said something that will provoke you to action, but if not, at the very least, to thought. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Reverend Kenyatta, and thank you for setting the stage as we really just have a dialogue, right, about what does this look like, with now some local leaders. So I'm excited to bring them on. I want to first bring on Pastor Dale Brown for him to introduce himself and give us a little bit of background about himself and his church.
Sure thing. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Reverend Kenyatta. As Ashley said, my name is Pastor Darrell Brown, Omaha native, born and raised here. I am the founding senior pastor of Kingdom Builders Christian Center here in Omaha, Nebraska. We will, as of next month, be 13 years old. Our congregation, we consider ourselves to be what we would deem to be radically inclusive. And we use that language only because others utilize the language of inclusive, and it does not really mean anything. And so we wanted to differentiate ourselves from those that utilize that language and utilize radically inclusive, to ensure that people know that they are able to come into our sanctuary with their full selves, and be welcomed for a spiritual experience. My work over over the entirety of my years in ministry has really been centered around spirituality and healing, Black liberation, and LGBTQ plus identities. And so that really is the foundation upon which I engage in all of the work that I engage in. And so I am just happy to be here and to engage in this conversation, hoping that I can drop a couple of nuggets as we have the conversation.
Well, thank you, Pastor Brown. I'm excited that you are here. And then our last panelist that I would love to introduce is Pastor Cavett. Pastor Cavett, can you give a little bit of background on your work in your faith community?
Okay, thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Kenyatta, for your words. And Pastor Brown, we thank you for being who you are and what you offer to the city. I'm Reverend Portia Cavett. I pastor Clare Memorial United Methodist Church for the last 14 years. It is a Protestant church in North Omaha. It is the largest African American church in the United Methodist system. But my background is in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. I will always be AME in my heart, my soul, and mind, and my upbringing. But to pastor this African American congregation in North Omaha, they considered themselves as a welcoming congregation, realizing that we all come from different backgrounds, but we want to make sure that we are embracing of all people. And so for our elderly, our young adults, our middle age, we have our conversations, but then we all agree that we have to accept people as they are.
Thank you, Pastor Cavett. And I'm really excited that all of you are here and engaging in this conversation. And so, Reverend Kenyatta really kind of set the stage of talking about what reproductive justice is, right? The power and choice that you have on if and when you have children, what that process looks like, and then how you decide to parent in the environment in which you raise your children. And so, maybe Pastor Brown, you can kick us off, and then Pastor Cavett will have you give your viewpoint on how does reproductive justice relate to faith. I think sometimes people feel like those things don't mix or it's not a part of the conversation. And so I would love for you to build on what Reverend Kenyatta kind of laid down as a foundation for that and talk about your experience. So Pastor Brown, would you mind starting?
Sure, definitely. Thank you, Reverend Kenyatta, for giving us the framework to even have this conversation. I think that when we talk about reproductive justice, we're talking about not just a person born with a uterus, their right to determine whether or not they are going to complete a pregnancy or not. But I think we're, as Reverend Kenyatta mentioned, talking about all of those other social determinants of health and of well-being with regard to individuals within our communities. And so when we talk about how this intersects with faith, I think that that is the basis of our work as faith leaders, is to be certain that we are meeting the needs of our communities, that to utilize the language of our sacred text, we want to be the storehouse of the community, and be able to provide what it is that we can provide to our communities. And I think that from a biblical perspective, I think that from a traditional perspective, that our ancestors would support the fact that we have to utilize the tool of faith to engage in our liberation. We have to utilize the tool of faith to engage in our well-being and to support our communities. And so I think that there is absolutely positively no disconnect between the two, because if we care for people, if we care for our communities, this subject, this topic is a part of that conversation. When we talk about these health disparities and things of that sort, the Bible speaks of what you do unto the least of these, you do unto me. Christ made that statement. And so we understand then, if we're looking at the least of these from a perspective of socioeconomic status, from a perspective of health disparities, from a perspective of our well-being, we understand that Black and brown bodies are the ones that fit that narrative. And so those are the individuals that I make a conscious effort to engage our congregation with, those that fit underneath the least of these. And I don't use that terminology to downplay anyone's identity or to speak negatively of where someone is, but the data is just the data. The facts are the facts of how Black wealth and Black well-being has been plundered within the context of this country. And so it most definitely is a justice conversation. It is a faith conversation. And I think that we would do ourselves a disservice to detach it from faith.
Thank you. Pastor Cavett, how does that relate, do you think, that same question, that reproductive justice, to your faith perspective?
Faith is everything. The Black church is an important part of people's life, and people come to the church for that, to be able to receive, and not only to see themselves, but how God views them and lifts them up. And if we look at all the stories in the Bible, and even of women and how they have been treated, those concubines or women that were given to men and became pregnant, they kept those children. And one in particular, when I think of how Sarah gave her handmaiden to Abraham and became pregnant. And even though she felt that she could not take care of the child, that she went out, but God still showed up. And so I think in the faith community, we know that the church will always be there. Those faith mothers in the church will be there. They might talk about you at the beginning when you get pregnant, but once that child appears, they are there. And we have to remember that in the days of old, that when a woman got pregnant, however old she was, she might have slipped away out of town somewhere, and then her and that child came back, and that child was probably raised by the grandmother or the great grandmother, but was still kept within the family. And so I think that we see that there were flawed people in the Bible, and we are all flawed, and that Christ died for all of us that we might have life.
Thank you, Pastor Cavett. So, y'all all have now kind of set the stage, right, of how you see reproductive justice showing up in your particular faith and how you all are approaching your ministries. And for me, and doing social justice work, so going down to the Capitol scene, who's having the conversation, there are various denominations that say abortion is wrong. Right. So thinking about, like we talked about, the larger reproductive justice lens, but going specifically to abortion access and utilizing abortions, they say, nope, that's wrong. And they use faith as their reasoning. And so, Reverend Kenyatta, can you maybe start us off with why faith and people reconcile abortion access and what that looks like very differently?
Well, first of all, we have to step back and see that though the language of faith is what is being used, what is really at play is a quest for political power. If you look from a historical context, prior to, say, 1970, if you went into a Black church, you would have been hard pressed to find a preacher who stood up on his pulpit and talked about abortion. You wouldn't have found it. Because historically, Black theology has always been rooted in the concept of liberation and emancipation. And those are the things that we talked about from our pulpits. And there was an understanding, not necessarily an acceptance. I'm not going to say, oh, people were happy, but there was an understanding that people, like Pastor Portia said, did what they needed to do. Somebody might have went out of town, like you said, and came back with a baby. Somebody might have went out of town and came back with no baby. Somebody might have went to the sister in the bush who got the herbs, who know what to do, and not had that child. And that was just what it was. And it wasn't until the evangelical movement of the 70s where what we now call as the religious right saw the potential of using abortion as a wedge issue to gain political power that the language of faith actually ever started to be used. Which is why I said in my little speech, reclaim your faith. Don't let these people use your Jesus to oppress people, because that's what they're doing. And so therefore, that is what makes it hard for some people to reconcile, because there is a narrative that has been fed to the general populace for about 40 years now at this point, built on a fallacy, built on this theological assertion that God does not like that, when it's murky. Literally, anybody can interpret it any way. There are a bunch of scriptures that qualify life beginning at breath, not birth. I mean, not conception. There are a bunch of there, like in Exodus, there's a whole scripture where there is law given on what should happen should someone accidentally kick someone in the belly and they lose their baby. They pay a fine. Whereas we saw earlier that for death, there was a whole different, for death of an actual living, breathing person, there was a whole different penalty, which lets you know that there, even in the law, there was a differentiation of what is considered killing. So this concept of life at conception and thus, therefore, abortion being murder is a fallacy. But it's been used as a weapon for political gain and to oppress people. It was the weapon that they picked up when they realized they could no longer use segregation as the way it's used. They're like, okay, so what else we can do? What else can we use? Because segregation ain't gonna work no more. So let's move on to something else. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Reverend Kenyatta. So for Pastor Daryl Brown and Pastor Cavett, I'm thinking about like that same question, but what does that look like for then the Black church to show up here, right? So we are in an environment in Nebraska, and we'll get to what's happening at the state legislature around bills being put in that would limit access or criminalize it and remove it completely, and then bills that are hoping to expand access. And I'm interested to get your take on the Black church here in Nebraska and in Omaha and their participation in this conversation of supporting reproductive rights and access, or if you're seeing that narrative being that they don't support, and why you think that is. So maybe Pastor Cavett, let's start with you and then go to Pastor Brown.
Well, I think in the Black church, we still don't talk about it. It's still a hush-hush topic that is not being openly discussed. And when we look at it and who's actually doing all the talking, might be the evangelicals with their right. And like Kenyatta said, it's a political thing because when we think about reproductive health, we should be looking at it in its totality, not only taking care of the mother and making sure that she has all the means to care for a child, whether it's through work, whether it's through affordable housing and living and being able to take care of a family. But to say that abortion is wrong or to take somebody's child from them and then put them in a foster home or whatever, you're still breaking up the family. And so it causes me to go back down to slavery time when the slave master raped the woman, because it was rape if you forced yourself upon someone and then sold off the children as they got older and separated the family. And so I still see that as a case today. And so if we don't deal with this systemic inequalities that we have, then we're not helping the situation. And so this is just a way that they address it. As it relates, I think we need to have more conversation in the church. We need to also talk about sex education. And that's another thing. We say that it's a parent's job to do, but we know that not every parent is open and up to that conversation. And so it falls back on the church to be there so that young people have someone to talk to.
Not only not to interrupt, not to stop you, Pastor Dara, but not only are some parents not up to the conversation, they didn't have it.
Right.
We're 3 generations into people probably not getting actual comprehensive sex education. And so they can't teach what they don't know.
That's true.
Absolutely. And it usually comes a day late and a dollar short. We find out after the fact what we need to know. We don't get it ahead of time, that's for sure. However, I say that to say that I think too, there's 2 pieces to this conversation. I think that one is understanding that first and foremost that our principles of faith do not dictate the way in which this country is run and the access that people have afforded to them. And I think that that is one place of arrogance that we walk in, that the way that we believe and what we hold dear to our hearts needs to be the commonplace belief of everybody. Because we have been lied to and are of the belief that this country is built on Christian principles, and that's a whole ass lie. Yeah. And so we understand that we try to pretend as though we subscribe to this real rigid fundamental Christianity, when in reality, we hear now that white form of Christianity is a whole different that's a different ball game. That's a different belief system. That is a belief system of people that have a chapel on one level of a slave castle, and on the lower level had a dungeon full of people enslaved and in bondage. And how you pray
Come
on
on,
one
preach,
level
sir.
of a building while you have people captured on a lower level, that you praying and talking to somebody different than I know. And so that concept as the basis and foundation of our conversation around this, first of all, I think is flawed, and it is a privileged conversation to begin with. I think secondarily, when we look at, as Reverend Kenyatta said, all of the nuance to biblical interpretation and our conversation in the Christian context of how do we come to a place of unity concerning this conversation. I think that's a difficult conversation to have, again, because as both of these queens have said, it's not a conversation that we have often enough in the faith community. And it is a hope of mine to hopefully construct some comprehensive sexual health education that also aligns with and is welcomed by the faith community so that we can begin engaging in these conversations. Uh, However, I think that we have to really look at, as has already been stated, what's at the root of this conversation, really? Um, what is this really about? Because it really is not about we are trying to save Black children. It is really not about, um, and I'm talking about those from the social structure that are in power, that that
Right.
that are trying to make these decisions. It is really not from a place of save Black bodies, save those that are in a lower socioeconomic status. It is not from that perspective at all. This really is a conversation about the preservation of whiteness. Two, as we know from the census numbers, as we know, it is projected that whiteness in this country is not going to be the majority for much
Majority.
longer. And yes, and so we understand that this is an attempt, honestly, to save whiteness, to be sure that white women that are being impregnated in a multitude of ways are not able to run down to an abortion clinic and abort a child, because that is affecting the numbers of white people in this country. And that really, in my opinion, in my experience, is really at the heart of this conversation. And when we understand that framework, that really can change the way that we theologically even approach the conversation.
That is absolutely true, Pastor Darrell. That is the
Right.
absolute truth. That is you can see it in the ways that they will push these egregious bills that are going to disproportionately affect Black women whose maternal mortality rate is already through the roof, whose
Through the
infant
roof.
mortality
Yes.
is already through the roof. They don't care about our
Yes.
bodies or our babies. It's about keeping white women who are actively choosing to have less children or no children at all from being able to make those choices.
Yep.
Listen, and I think that is a great segue to really unpacking what's happening here in our footprint. So, on Thursday, February 24th, three bills will be heard that would ban abortion in Nebraska. So we have LB 933, which would make all abortions illegal and is effectively called a trigger ban. So when folks expect Roe v. Wade at the federal level to be overturned and open it up for states to make decisions, this bill would automatically go into effect and say it is criminalized to have an abortion. Any doctor that would perform an abortion would face these consequences, and same with that person that had that fetus and made that decision. And so that is a prioritized bill that will be heard at hearing on the 24th. We also have LB 781, which would ban abortion around 6 weeks. This is even before a person would even know that they could be potentially pregnant or even have a missed period. And it's a total, almost a total near ban. Okay. And then we have 1086, which would further put unnecessary burdens and restrictions on a medical abortion, which would limit expanding abortion access through medications, which we already are seeing tightening here in Nebraska. There are some proactive bills happening, but I really want to focus our attention on the bans, as again, we have those hearings set. It's timely for this week. And Reverend Kenyatta, you named that, right? We see these bills and legislation and like political power being rooted in what we see introduced. And so can you speak to how these types of bills and what we're seeing now are further causing harm for Black bodies and Black folks?
Absolutely. As I mentioned when I was interjecting in Pastor Darrow's time, the fact of the matter is that uh, Black women in this country have some of the worst maternal mortality and infant mortality rate in the industrialized world, in the Western world. We are a country that is considered developed. I hate that term, but considered developed, and yet Black and brown women, especially Black women, are dying while they're having babies. And the fact of the matter is, bills like these that criminalize physicians who are already in precarious situations cause medical decisions to be made that are not going to help that in any way, shape, or form. It is going to make doctors take longer to make necessary medical decisions that they need to make out of fear of being criminalized for doing their job. And and the the truth of the matter is, it is going to cause a system that already disbelieves Black women when they say that something is happening to them and something is wrong with them in their bodies when they are when they are gestating. It's going to cause deaf ears to become even more deaf. And that just means there's going to be more Black women dying while trying to bring life into the world. And so these bills, these egregious bills, always disproportionately affect Black, brown, indigenous, and women of color and poor women the most. And the fact of the matter, and the reasoning is because historically, if you look, middle class, upper middle class, and above white women have always been able to avail themselves of what they need whenever they need it. If that meant hopping on a plane and going to a different country to get whatever procedure they needed and coming back. We don't have those liberties. We don't have that privilege. We have to have access that is truly accessible. And these bills make it hard uh, for people who have limited resources to get the health care that they need. They, like even here in our state, I live in Georgia. Atlanta is kind of the hub of the Southeast because so many of the states around us have had similar things come. And so now people are still having to travel miles to access the healthcare that they need. And some people just can't. And so then we could run into the other social issues we talk about. So now people are having children that they can't afford, that they didn't intend to have, but there's no resources for them to raise those children. And nobody cares about the fact that there are no resources to raise those children. So for me, it's just a trickle down. Like these bills just affect healthcare across the board, but also affect the lives of Black and brown people across the board.
Thank you for that. Can you believe that we're almost at time? Like literally, it felt like we just got on this virtual space and that we just engaged in this conversation. And I do not practice an organized religion. And I felt like y'all didn't really took me to church. I'm like writing notes. I'm like, let me follow up on this. Like this has been such a fruitful conversation. And I appreciate everyone's different perspective, right? Like we all are different ages and identities. Like, right, we all have these perspectives. Y'all are operating in different faith segments, and yet we're able to have this conversation and really sit, I think, in the messiness of what this looks like for Black community. And I appreciate that because I felt like we don't get that luxury. We don't get that luxury to critically reflect, challenge each other, evolve and iterate, especially around Black bodies and what that looks like. And so I appreciate everyone's willingness to be able to sit with us and sit with the IB Black Girl community around this conversation. So as we wrap up our time, I would really like for each of you to leave one call to action. If folks didn't go to church with us today, that's fine. But what is that one thing that you want to leave them with as we continue to sit in this conversation? And I want to be really clear that IB Black Girl is committed to this long-term, right, conversation and how we talk about this. Like, it's not just because we have the hearings coming up. It's not just because it's this immediate urgency to engage and think about the political impacts. But again, we deserve the opportunity to explore what this conversation means for our community and how we show up for each other and use our voice in this space. And so, we want to keep building intentional spaces like this to dialogue. And so, what is that one thing that y'all want to leave people with as we continue to engage? And Pastor Cavett, I will start with you.
Okay. Well, one thing I want everyone to understand is that reproductive health is a human right, that you have a right to advocate for yourself and what your wishes are, what your needs are. And so it's one of reaching out and having that conversation with whoever you want to have that conversation with, and not feel small or that you can't speak to that. Don't allow someone else to tell you that you are less than, or that you should not, or you've made the wrong decision, or that they're going to help you once you have that child. And I think that's what society has said, but then they've turned their back on you when you need them the most. So it's important for all of us to come together and to raise our voices and to stand as a united front to say that women have the right to choose and to speak up and to be heard, whatever their view is.
Thank you, Pastor Cavett. Reverend Kenyatta?
I actually have two. Um, so the first one is statistics show that 1 in 4 women that in this country have had an abortion, which means that you know someone who's had an abortion. So my first call to action is to lean into compassionate care, because somebody that you know who may have never said anything to you has had an abortion and is listening to you deride and belittle the choice that they made that they felt like was best for their lives. So the first call to action is to understand that the people around you are living lives that you may not know, and to be as compassionate as you can be. Number two, go to Just Faith for the number 4, ajustworld.org. And this is a statement of justice that was written by me, compiled by cross-movement faith organizers, that outlines what a just world looks like from a faith perspective, from each of our lanes of advocacy. And if you sign on to this statement, you will start receiving the emails from us. As we are actually about to start doing trainings for clergy and for congregations around how to have these conversations with your congregation. So go to justfaith4justworld.org.
Thank you, Reverend Kenyatta. And I put the link in the chat. And then lastly, Pastor Daryl Brown, take us home.
Love it. So my ask of or call to action would be that people engage in these conversations in the privacies of their families. And the reason that's my call to action is because I believe that that allows people to sit in the messiness of it, as you stated. But one thing is for sure, two things for certain: public policy is often motivated by private family values, very often. That people are going to vote according to the way in which they have been raised in their family background, their cultural context, and what have you. So the more that we engage in these conversations in private, in the context of our families, and bring up the nuance of these conversations in our family context, I think it impacts the way that people show up politically. And essentially, that is what we'll need, is for people to show up politically and to vote in favor of people having access to the care that they're in need of.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for being here with us tonight. It was the time, I cannot believe how fast the time flew and engaging, and we could stay here and keep talking. So we got to have y'all back. We got to do a part two, because I mean, I feel like we just started scratching the surface. But I just really appreciate everyone's brilliance and willingness and perspectives on this topic. As I mentioned earlier, IB Black Girl is very much engaged in what reproductive justice looks like in Nebraska. So we have our birth justice work where we're focusing on Black birthing people, and also very clearly standing in that we need healthcare access and choice, which includes abortion access. So we will be going to the Capitol this Thursday, February 24th. The hearing starts at 1:30. If you are interested in testifying and bringing your voice opposing abortion bans, so you are not okay with abortion bans, please visit our website. We have tools around crafting your testimony, things that you need to do. We will be there in partnership with community folks like Women's Fund of Omaha, Planned Parenthood, and ACLU of Nebraska, a meeting at about noon at the Capitol building, so that again we can make sure that we are really clear and have folks in solidarity with you, as it can sometimes feel hostile and as well as really difficult to express your points of view at the state legislature. So if you are interested in testifying, it is not too late. Please come down. Plan for it to be a very long day. We are planning for lots of testimony on both sides. And so if you are able to take off of work, if you're able to secure childcare, please come down. If you're interested and don't have access to those things, we can provide stipends for gas, for food, and for childcare. So please reach out to us at hello@ibblackgirl.org, or send us a DM on our Facebook or Instagram or Twitter pages, and we'll make sure that we follow up with you so that you are able to get what you need in order to use your voice on the 24th. Again, I want to just thank our panelists for such a fruitful and meaningful conversation. This is not the last time that you will see them or us in this space. And so I appreciate people engaging. I appreciate people having the conversation, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. So with that, have a great night and thank you.
Thank you.